Okay, so in the next few lectures, I want to talk about Rawls and Nozick. And Rawls and Nozick both reach some pretty extreme positions. Rawls is probably a good bit to the left of Bernie Sanders, or at least pretty much where Bernie Sanders is. And Nozick, on social issues, he's not that conservative. But when it comes to economic issues, Nozick is incredibly conservative. He's probably to the right of Paul Ryan. Well, how do they reach these conclusions? That'll be one of the issues I look at, and I don't think either of them quite establishes the strong conclusions they want to. But I do think that they have some interesting arguments, and they might establish some conclusions even if they're weaker than they think. And I think it'll help us in thinking about these issues of justice to go through Rawls and Nozick's argument. If we disagree with them, why? What's important to us? Now, one thing to note about both of them is that they are not utilitarians. Before Rawls, people tended to think of, at least for a while, in America, in political philosophy circles at least, utilitarianism was the dominant way of thinking about political issues. What will make the most people happy and the greatest amount of happiness? Well, Rawls, among other things, launched a really powerful criticism of this utilitarian way of thinking about justice. And I think that's interesting even if we don't agree with Rawls' conclusions. So what I'm going to start with is to talk about Rawls' own method, his Kantian method, and his reasons for rejecting utilitarianism. And this is interesting because even people like Nozick, who do not agree with Rawls' conclusions, a lot of them will follow Rawls in thinking that, yeah, Kantianism is a better way to think about politics than is utilitarianism. Nozick uses Kantianism to reach his conclusions. They're radically different from Rawls, but insofar as he says, yeah, utilitarianism is not the way you want to go, Nozick and Rawls agree. So why then does Rawls not like utilitarianism? Well, Rawls says the first thing we ought to think about in politics is justice. Whether or not what we're doing is just. And Rawls says, well, utilitarianism is not a good way at all to think about justice. Well, why not? Well, to put it bluntly, because you can imagine utilitarianism telling us to do all kinds of things that any sane person would recognize as unjust. Remember, I said utilitarianism doesn't do well with rights, and it doesn't do well with fairness. Doesn't do well with rights because we think of, well, rights mean that there are certain things people should never be allowed to do to us no matter what. And utilitarianism, well, it can't say that. What utilitarianism can say is, well, there's some things we generally shouldn't do to people because usually it'll have bad consequences. But if doing it has great consequences or not doing it has bad consequences, then go on and do it. So, imagine, think of my example of cutting up someone for his or her organs. Now, a utilitarian will say, well, of course, in real life, that would never create the best consequences long term. It would come out. That would be terrible. But again, that kind of misses the point, right? The reason we don't do that to people is we have a right not to be killed for our organs. We have a right not to be used in that way. And think about fairness, right? Well, you can imagine a situation, where there's some unsolved murder, there's a lot of social unrest, the police are desperate, you can imagine where it might create the most happiness to frame an innocent person. Imagine this person is a criminal, but he hasn't committed this crime. The police say to themselves, well, we'll send him to jail, we'll prevent future crimes. That might be good utilitarian reasoning. And the utilitarian will, of course, say, well, in real life, it'll never work out that way. But again, that misses the point. We shouldn't do that because it's not fair. And think about this applied to economic issues. Imagine that there is some policy that would make the rest of us just incredibly well off, but it leaves some small group of people just miserable, barely able to feed themselves, or heck, even starving. And imagine that person asking us, or somebody from that group asking us, well, okay, how do you guys justify me doing so badly? And we said, well, because it helps us do well. And he says, well, but how's that fair to me? And we say, well, it's not. It stinks for you. It's terrible for you. We don't care about fairness, though. We just care about happiness, and you doing really badly helps the rest of us do really well. Well, that would be just a weird thing to say to somebody, right? Look, we do care about fairness. It is important. And now the utilitarian theory won't generally recommend unfair things because we care about fairness, and because we do, doing that will usually create unhappiness, but it just doesn't register it in the right way, right? It is important to us in and of itself that policies are fair, that we are treated fairly, that other people are treated fairly. The utilitarian just doesn't care about fairness as such, and because they don't, they miss an important part of the way we talk about politics. So Rawls says that Kantianism is a much better way to think about politics. It fits with justice because justice is about rights, justice is about fairness. And Kantianism does really well with both of these, or so it seems. Remember, Kant says the formula of humanity, you should never treat people as mere means. Well, that gives you a good basis, a good foundation for rights. There are certain things you shouldn't do to people, no matter how good the consequences might be. And think about the formula of universal law. This fits really well with this idea of fairness. In fact, if something's unfair, you would not allow it to pass the formula of universal law, right? Unfair things, like, remember, think my great example, pushing up this person's grade who hasn't earned it, unfair things fail the formula of universal law because they're unfair. All right. So that does seem, that Kantianism then might be a really good way to think about politics. But there's a problem. And the utilitarian is going to push and say, look, my theory, my approach can give us clear answers. We want to know whether we should raise or lower taxes. When we ask the economists, what's that going to do to economic growth? And we ask the psychologists, well, who's going to benefit? What are they going to get? Is that going to make them happy or not? My method, the utilitarian will say, we just need some good social science, and we'll figure out how to slice up the economic pie. We'll figure out who should get what. You Kantians, yeah, it sounds real nice. Always treat people as ends in themselves, never as mere means. But what in the world does that mean in actual practice? Are we using someone as a mere means when we tax them to pay for Medicare or Medicaid? Are we using someone as a mere means when we allow his employer to ship his job overseas? Well, tell me why. Or what kinds of, you say, we should only pick principles we would all agree to, yet good luck with that, the utilitarian will say. You put 10 people in a room and ask them to agree on the basic principles of society, they're not going to do it. Well, that tells you, the utilitarian will say, there probably are no political principles we would universalize, no principles you could get every single person to agree to. If you're not going to be able to do it with 10, and you're probably not, good luck with 300 million, right? That's how many we have in America. So the utilitarian charge against Rawls is, yeah, this sounds real nice, Rawls. It's not going to work. It's not going to give you answers. Kantianism is just not going to be a way to approach political philosophy because it's not going to give you answers, even though it might sound really nice. Well, Rawls has an answer to this. In fact, I think the original position and the veil of ignorance that Dworkin talks so much about are Rawls's answers. So let's look at them and see how they are supposed to answer this challenge. Okay, so remember I said the utilitarian challenge to Rawls is going to be, well, Kantianism sounds wonderful, but it's not going to give us clear answers. What in the world are the principles that everyone would agree to, Rawls? Well, Rawls will say, well, this is where the original position and the veil of ignorance come in. The veil of ignorance, imagine you are choosing the basic rules of society, but you don't know who you are and you don't know what society is like. And so Rawls would say, well, what kinds of principles would you pick? You don't know whether you're a man or a woman. You don't know, since you don't know what society's like, you don't know if your society is sexist or not. You don't know if you're black, white, a member of another racial group. You don't know if you're religious, and if you are religious, you don't know what religion or how important it is to you. You don't know what kinds of talents you have and how marketable those talents are. You might come out of the original position and find that you are an incredibly talented musician and can make millions. You might find that you're a brilliant, brilliant businessman and again can make millions. Or you might find that there's nothing you do particularly well, nothing that you can sell that people really want to buy. You just don't know. And so Rawls would say, because you don't know any features about yourself, well, any principles you pick from the original position, even if you were just looking out for yourself, you would only pick fair principles. Why? If you pick unfair principles, well, they might come back to bite you. A good way to think about the original position is, imagine, let me give you guys a little puzzle. You have a piece of cake and 5 children. And let's imagine you're lazy, so you don't want to do all the effort of slicing up the cake yourself, but you want to make sure the cake is equally divided. How would you get one of the kids to slice it, assuming all the kids are, they all just look out for themselves, they want cake? How would you get one of the kids to slice it and make sure that he does it fairly, though? Think about that for a second. What would you do? Well, one way to do it, let him slice, but tell him after he slices, he picks last, right? He gets the last slice. He will slice that cake fairly with laser precision. And why? Because if he doesn't, he will get the small piece, right? From the original position, we will pick fair principles, and we will pick fair principles because if we don't, it might come back to bite us. And Rawls will say, so you see the original position really fits with this idea of fairness. And Rawls will also say it allows us to see principles we would all agree to, because lots of times when we pick political principles, whether we realize it or not, we pick principles that benefit us. Well, but the original position doesn't let you do that. You couldn't pick principles to benefit yourself because you don't know who you are or what's important to you. So we would agree on principles, and they would be fair principles. Well, okay, so Rawls says whatever principles that we would pick from the original position, those are the principles of justice. And Rawls thinks that there's, for him, the original position is kind of like a math problem. And if you guys listen to Dworkin, oh my goodness, does Rawls ever think it's like a math problem? He gets real technical real quick. One of the reasons I did not have you guys read Rawls, but instead listen to the Dworkin interview. So Rawls says, this is like a math problem. This is like a simple equation. There's only one right answer or only one right set of answers, and those are my principles of justice. Now we'll talk about whether that's really true in the next lecture. Rawls' first principle, which I'll introduce in a second, most people agree with this. It's not too controversial, and most people do think we would pick it from the original position. The second principle is way more controversial. Some people say we wouldn't pick it at all. Some people say, well, it's a possible answer, Rawls, but it's not the only principle we might pick for this part of the equation. And if that's the case, and there's multiple good answers, well, where do we go from there? What does that mean for Rawls? We'll talk a lot more about that in the next lecture. Now, one other thing that's important to note with Rawls' principles of justice, they are, as Rawls puts it, lexically ordered. Well, what does that mean? Lexically ordered is just a really fancy way of saying the first principle trumps the second. If the second principle would recommend something, and we'll talk about how this might be, that is at odds with the first principle, well, first principle just trumps the second. That's all that lexical ordering means. I don't know why he didn't say that, but Rawls loves his fancy terminology. What can you do? But let's finish by talking about the first principle and why we would choose it from the original position. Well, what is the first principle of justice? The first principle of justice says each person is to have an equal basic right to the most extensive basic liberties compatible with similar liberties for others. Wow, I bet that's really clear to you, right? What that means is just, I don't need to even explain it. I'm joking, right? That is really unclear. What Rawls means by this, again, Rawls is not a clear writer. He does not feel the need to put his ideas clearly. What he means by this is from the original position, we would want to choose protections for basic rights. We would make sure we had something like the Bill of Rights in place. We would also probably make sure that we had something like the post-Civil War amendments to the Constitution in place. We would want to protect speech, religion, and assembly, and we would not want to allow people to be discriminated against on the basis of their religion, their race, or their gender. Well, why not? Why would you, from the original position, not want to allow religious discrimination? Imagine you're only looking out for yourself. It'd be real nice if you cared about other religions, but you don't. You just care about yourself. Why would you not want to allow religious discrimination? Well, because again, you might come out of the original position and find that you are the proverbial kid who gets the small slice of cake, right? If you allow discrimination against certain religions, you might come out and find that you are a member of a religion that a lot of people don't like, and that it's really important for you to practice that religion. You wouldn't want to allow people to put laws restricting religious practice for no good reason in place, and you wouldn't want to allow religious discrimination because you might be a member of an unpopular religion. Same with speech. You might come out of the original position and find that you have a really unpopular opinion, and that it's really important for you to express that unpopular opinion. That's perfectly possible. You'd want protections for religion. Why would you want everybody to be equal before the law? Why wouldn't you want to allow gender discrimination? Why would you want the courts to treat everybody equally, man or woman, black or white, Muslim or Christian, atheist, agnostic, short, tall, whatever? Well, because again, you don't know who you're going to be. And if the law treats some people unequally, if we don't give due process, the whole idea of due process is that the law treats everyone equally. If we don't allow that, well, you might be a loser. You can, one interesting thing you might do, think of the other things on the Bill of Rights and whether or not it's clear we would choose them from the original position. And most of them we would. I didn't list it here, but think about search and seizure, right? Police can't search your person or your property without a warrant. Well, you'd probably want that protection from the original position. You might be the kind of person that the police love to hassle. And if you were, well, you would want some protections that would keep them from doing that without a good reason. So first principle of justice, very intuitive. Most of us agree with the conclusion, and I think most of us can agree with Rawls' argument for how and why we would choose it from the original position. So we'll stop there. Hopefully you guys understand the original position. Next time we'll start with where it gets controversial. Rawls' second principle of justice.